It doesn't look like your dog is deciding whether to listen when it begins, and that's exactly why the moment passes without being recognized. Your dog is still responding, still aware, still behaving in ways that feel familiar enough not to question. But there is something that happens before the response now, something that didn't exist in the same way before, and it sits quietly between your cue and their action. That moment is small enough to ignore, but consistent enough to repeat, and repetition is what gives it meaning. You give a cue, and your dog looks at you, not in a distracted way, not in a confused way, but in a way that holds just slightly longer than it used to. The response still comes, but it comes after something has already happened internally. That internal step is not visible in isolation, which is why it is so easy to overlook in real time. But when the same sequence appears again in the next interaction, and then again after that, it stops behaving like coincidence and starts behaving like process. There was a time when your dog responded without interruption, where the cue and the action were connected in a way that felt immediate and continuous. Now that connection has been interrupted, and something has been inserted into the space between signal and movement. That insertion is not dramatic, but it is consistent, and consistency is what defines behavior over time. Once it becomes part of the process, it replaces what used to be automatic. You begin to notice it in movement, where your dog starts to act before fully aligning with you, rather than aligning first and then moving from that position. The behavior still looks correct, but the order has changed, and order is what determines structure. Now the same sequence appears in recall, where your dog hears you, acknowledges you, and then pauses just briefly before moving toward you. The response still happens, but it no longer begins from the same place. That difference does not disappear once it appears. It spreads. You notice it when you stop moving, because your dog continues forward slightly before adjusting back toward you, creating a delay that wasn't there before. The correction still happens, but it happens after the action begins, not before it. Now the same pattern repeats across different situations, not tied to one specific moment, but tied to the way your dog processes your cues. It appears during movement, during stillness, and during transitions where there used to be no interruption. At this point, everything still feels normal, because the behavior itself has not broken down in a way that demands attention. But the process behind the behavior has already changed, and that process determines what happens next. Because your dog is no longer moving from certainty. They are moving from a decision. That decision happens before the response begins, even if it only takes a fraction of a second, and it becomes consistent enough to shape behavior over time. Once that step becomes part of the sequence, it replaces what used to be immediate. Now the pattern becomes more noticeable, not because it becomes larger, but because it becomes more frequent across different interactions. Your dog hears, processes, and then acts, creating a sequence that repeats consistently. That repetition gives the moment weight, because anything that repeats begins to define behavior rather than interrupting. And once it begins to define behavior, it becomes part of the structure. Most people don't notice this because the outcome still appears correct, and the behavior still matches what they expect to see. But behavior is not defined by the outcome alone, it is defined by how that outcome begins. And that beginning has already changed. Your dog is still responding, but not from the same internal position, and that difference introduces variation into how responses feel. Some remain immediate, while others carry a slight delay that feels subtle but consistent. That variation is not random, and it does not resolve on its own once it becomes part of the process. It follows the same pattern every time, even if it is difficult to recognize at first. Because your dog is no longer reacting automatically to your cue, but evaluating before acting, even if that evaluation is brief and almost invisible. And once evaluation replaces instinct, behavior becomes conditional rather than automatic. Now the interaction begins to feel slightly different, even if you cannot immediately explain why that feeling exists. The connection is still there, but it lacks the immediacy it once had, and the responses feel slightly removed from the moment. That feeling is not imagined, because it reflects a real shift in how behavior is being generated internally. Your dog is still engaged, still aware, but no longer anchored to the same starting point. Because what has changed is not whether your dog responds, but where the response begins, and that difference carries through everything that follows. Your dog is still doing what you ask, but the action no longer starts from the same place it once did. And once the starting point changes, the pattern begins to build, repeating in ways that feel small at first but become consistent over time. It builds quietly, without conflict, but with enough repetition to stabilize. Now that moment is no longer occasional, because it has become part of the process that defines how your dog responds to you. It is expected, even if it is not consciously recognized. And once it becomes expected, It becomes part of the relationship, shaping how interaction unfolds in subtle but consistent ways. Because by the time you notice it clearly, it has already been happening for a while. What you are seeing now is not the beginning of the change, but the moment it becomes visible enough to recognize. And what happens before your dog decides to listen is the part that determines everything that follows.